Check 1 2, testing 1 2. Check 1 2, testing 1 2. Check 1 1. Check 1 2, testing. Check 1.
Oh, walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Oh, walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Gonna walk and never tire. Walk and never tire. Walk and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Oh, walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Gonna sing and never tire. Sing and never tire. Sing and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Oh, walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Gonna shout and never tire. Shout and never tire. Shout and never tire. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. Oh, walk together, children, don't you get weary. Sing together, children, don't you get weary. Shout together, children, don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land. There's a great camp meeting in the promised land.
God's gonna set this world on fire. Yes, yes, yes. God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah. God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. Yes, yes, yes. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. Hallelujah. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. set this world on fire. Yes, God's gonna set this world on fire one of these days. Hallelujah. God's gonna set this world on fire. God's gonna set this world on fire. One of these days. In the Lord, my soul's been anchored in the Lord. In the Lord, my soul's been anchored in the Lord. In the Lord, my soul's been anchored in the Lord. In the Lord, my soul's been anchored in the Lord.
My hope is built on nothing less
My soul's been anchored in the Lord.
than Jesus' blood and righteousness.
Hi, everybody. So good to see everybody today. I'm not going to talk very long because we have 400 years to cover, so we're going to be out of the gate quick today. But I want to introduce myself. I'm Sonia DeYoung from the call office, and we have a lot of new people here today, so if you ever have questions, please always call our office. We're happy to help. I basically just wanted to say a couple thank yous today. I wanted to thank Michigan Humanities for the grant for this course that allows us to pay all the expenses and offer it to you free of charge. And I also want to very much thank our 4 presenters here who have done so much work on this effort, and I want to introduce them all so you can give them a round of applause. We have Deborah Perry. We have Dwayne Davis. We have Fred Johnson. And in the back, we've got Nate Glasper. So I'm not going to say anything more. I'm going to turn it over to Fred, who's going to lead us off for the day.
Such a pleasure to see you all. Thank you for coming out to this moment to celebrate 400 years of African American music history. And it's good to celebrate. In a time where there's so much division, so much turmoil, we need to remember, it's good to remember that no matter what's happening here on earth is beneath the gaze and the authority of a living God who has done so much for us. So no matter what's happening here, it's always a time for us to celebrate because of him. Please join me with just a brief word of prayer. Father God, thank you, Lord, for all of your provision. Thank you for the majesty of your darling Son, who of his own free will gave of himself and of you so that we might be redeemed. God, we love you. We thank you. We're grateful to you. We magnify you. We adore you. Please fill this place with your presence. May your Holy Spirit do whatever needs to be done for whoever needs to have it done. We thank you in all things. In the name of the majesty of the Christ, amen. 400 years of African American history. We're starting out talking about, okay. Okay. Of course, the appropriate place to start is the beginning. Talking about America as a coastal nation, 13 colonies that become 13 states under British rule. At some point, that relationship between Great Britain and the United States, or should I say their American colonies, got to a point where they simply could not coexist together. And on April 19, 1775, the weather broke. And through a series of things, events, and circumstances, the colonies have been allowed to govern themselves for more than 3 or 4 generations. But it finally got to a point where the American residents of those colonies had said, we can no longer live with the tyranny of a absentee landlord that's telling us how to run our affairs. The British had this idea of government that was called virtual representation. I can be thousands of miles away from you and still tell you what to do. I won't do anything to harm the empire because we're all one unitary empire. The Americans said, that's not going to work. We need somebody right here who lives where we are to give us direct representation. The British refused to do that. That and several other things of imperial overreach led the Americans on April 19, 1775 to meet with force, British forces at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and what had been a talking war at that point became a shooting war known as the American Revolution. In 1776, specifically, on July 4, 1776, a committee had appointed Thomas Jefferson to draft a document to announce to the world why the American colonies felt it necessary to separate themselves from Great Britain. It's so typical of the 18th century where before we start to fight, I'm going to explain to you why we're fighting. And Thomas Jefferson summed it up in the following way, just briefly. He started off by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. As my late pastor, the Reverend Dr. Clifton Rhodes, used to say, that statement all by itself would be a sermon. We hold these truths to be self-evident. For thousands of years, human beings have been ruled in a way where the king or the queen or the emperor, if they wanted your opinion, they told you what it was. If they wanted you to have a point of view, they told you what it was. We're in charge, you're not. I'm the boss, you're not. What's the problem? But here the Americans are taking a hard right and doing something different. We, the people, hold certain truths that we're not asking you about. We can see for ourselves. They are self-evident. And what are they? They include, among other things, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Can you imagine how revolutionary that was? To say that all men, and we know in the 21st century, that means all women as well, are created equal. Throughout the whole history of humanity, relationships between ruled and rulers have been based on mass inequality. But now they're saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable. Nothing I can do can take them from you. I can stop you from exercising your freedom, but I can't take it from you. I can take your life, but I can't deny you the right to life. I can take your right to pursue your happiness, but I can't take the right from you. I can do things to keep you from enjoying it, but the right is there by granting of God. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights implies we are taking among ourselves the right to go and get something. The notion is we have the right, not just to stand here and wait for something to happen to us, but to be proactive and go get it. Go get these rights. Governments are instituted among men. People are not just born and government shows up. Men and women create governments that they want and that they derive. Those governments, whatever government we say, derive. The powers that they come from. Governments exist, and then they derive their powers. Certain powers come from those governments, and then borrowing the phrase from John Locke, the English philosopher, those powers can only be based upon the consent of the governed. Let that hang for a minute. Think about that. Those who rule must go to those who are being ruled and get their permission to pass laws. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And if something's going wrong, the people who you must get your consent from, if something goes sideways, they have the right to change it, to modify it, and to institute new government. George Washington, the first president of the United States and the supreme commander of the Continental Army, spent 8 years in battle with the British. And in 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, finally, the British were defeated at Yorktown, and then the Treaty of Paris of 1783, America had an independent nation based upon principles of freedom. It was a free, independent country, free of Great Britain. But something was questionable. Was it total victory? In a certain way of speaking, yes, it was. But on the other hand, there was something already going on. You see, because inside of that free, independent nation, America had made a space for a certain type of tyranny, a certain type of oppression, a certain type of thing of evil called slavery. How can you coexist in a state of freedom and have within your body politic make room for slavery? It was a system that was founded in violence, established in violence, maintained in violence, perpetuated by violence always. How do you coexist like that? They found a way. The transatlantic slave trade had been going on since the 1500s, where people in Africa were bought, sold like animals, like property, driven below decks to live in miserable conditions, their own waste with dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, typhus, typhoid, hot, fetid, stinking air, and then brought to the New World, primarily to the Caribbean, primarily Jamaica, Haiti, but also a good number of people went to South America, and then there was that tributary that came to North America, where they were destined for a life of misery in perpetuity, to be sold and traded and disposed of as per the whims of their so-called owners. In North America, in the Western world, the kind of slavery practiced in America was something called chattel slavery. The chair you sat down upon. Not one person in here asked the chair for permission before they sat. It's a thing. Likewise, they were treated as things. It's the only country in the world that's ever tried to literally reduce the human being to a thing. So the revolution came. America achieved its independence. Slavery existed. But the black people inside of that system, as narrow as it was, as confining as it was, they found a way of still creating community among themselves. They found a way of finding Christ and believing in God, although the Christ that they were given was a version of God that told them that they were supposed to be enslaved, that it was their duty to be good slaves and to obey their masters. They found a way of expressing themselves through song. And America lived with this dual nature of being a free, independent country that still had to find a way of dealing with the tyranny inside. Oftentimes, that coping was done through music.
Mic is on. Good afternoon. I tell you, in preparing for this, we had the pleasure of sitting in meetings. Deborah, myself, Fred, Sonia, Nate, and I got a history lesson every time. I'm taking notes. This man knows so much about history that it's mind-boggling. We're going to talk. Sonia, am I in? Almost? Okay. But we're going to talk hand in hand about what was going on musically during the periods that Fred is speaking of. American history is, African American history is America's history. It's not doing it. It's doing it. I believe that out of ugly comes beauty. Look at the pressure that diamonds from which they come, buried deep in the earth. Lots of pressure, lots of heat, and yet we get this beautiful gem. Or look at the irritation of that creates a pearl, and it becomes this stunning thing that people seek. Or look at the beauty of this pottery that is broken, and yet the Japanese can take it and repair it with gold and make something even more valuable than what it started out to be. This is going real slow. I don't know why, but it. There you go. Okay. Works a little differently at home. So out of ugly comes beauty. So we're not talking about pearls. We're not talking about this Japanese art. We're not talking about diamonds. But we are talking about a period that is, for African Americans, was very trying. It was trying for the whole country, but it was very trying. And so the music that they created is a folk music that laid the foundation for Deborah's not just here to be, she's going to talk too, but not right now. It's a folk music that laid the foundation for much of the popular American music that we find today. It's an oral tradition. It's something that's passed down through hearing and speaking and clicking. Thank you. It's stubborn, right? And the American folk tradition comes from two main bodies. The biggest body, even though we have lots of ethnic groups that have contributed, the major contributors of American folk music are Anglo-Americans from the British Isles, where they've brought music to Appalachia and other places, children's songs and songs like Barbary Allen, and African Americans, whose folk music was created out of a need to express what they were going through. Today, we're going to talk about several areas of that folk music, which include field hollers, work songs, ring shouts, spirituals, blues, early gospel. And so those are the areas that we are going to cover. I think I'm just going to skip right past. Maybe you can get that. Things are slow here at Calvin. I think the first thing, Deborah, is that call and response that a lot of this music is based on. Is that Dr. Sawyer over there? Dr. Sawyer, I hate to just put you on the spot, but because so much of this music is call and response, you want to lead us in one? I think that, yeah, you can use a mic here or. You want a mic? Here's.
Check.
Is this on? Good. Now, you have to repeat after me. He's a long John.
He's a long John.
He's a long gone.
He's a long John.
He's a gone.
He's a gone.
Like a turkey in the corn.
Like a turkey in the
with his long clothes on.
With his long clothes.
He's gone.
He's gone.
With his shiny blade.
With his shiny blade.
Got it in his hand.
God is in his hand.
Gonna chop all the live oaks.
Gonna chop all the live oaks.
That are in this land.
That are in this land.
He's a long John.
He's a long John.
He's a long gone.
He's a long gone.
He's a gone.
He's a gone.
Like a turkey in the corn.
Like a turkey in the.
He's gone.
He's gone.
He's gone.
He's gone.
Last one. He's gone.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So you can see that that call and response has a leader, and then you do exactly what they're saying. Uh, you, you know a call and response?
Yes.
Okay.
This is a call and response song I do with my students. It's entitled Ranky Tank, and it's a simple rhythm. It's a stomp and then a clap, so I'll start it off. And then you're just going to do the response. You're going to go Ranky Tank.
Ranky Tank.
1, 2, ready, go.
Ranky Tank.
I'm gonna rank.
Ranky Tank.
I'm gonna rank.
Ranky Tank.
Down in the cornfield.
Ranky Tank.
I'm gonna rank.
Ranky
So that's
Tank.
the idea. Now we're going to speed the rhythm up.
Oh.
And the reason why we're doing this is because doing these rhythms out in the field helped them get the flow of the work because they had to turn out so much work in a day. So getting that rhythm going a little faster would help productivity of what they were picking out there in the field. So we're going to pick up the tempo just a little faster.
All right.
Oh, rank your tank.
Ranky Tank.
Oh, rank your tank.
Ranky Tank.
Papa's gonna rank.
Ranky Tank.
Mom's gonna rank.
Ranky Tank.
Down in the cornfield,
Ranky Tank.
I'm gonna rank.
Ranky Tank.
Sun is hot.
Ranky Tank.
See me a ranking.
Ranky Tank.
Oh, rank your tank.
Ranky Tank.
Oh, rank your tank.
Ranky Tank.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's call and response. And that would be a technique that's used throughout a lot of this music. And it is also, it's used today. She talked about working in the field and the music accompanying that. And I want to play an example of a field holler.
I won't be here long. Oh, oh, doggone get me here. Doggone get me here.
Now, that was a singular person singing that, but that was an example of a field holler. Why would we do that? Why would we sing? What do you think? Lightens the burden, right? It distracts you in a sense. You know, in The King and I, she said, whistle a happy tune whenever you feel afraid. Well, this isn't fear, but this is the burden of work. I want to play another example, and this is a work song. Perhaps.
I've been walking a road a long time.
Call and response.
Oh Lord, I have been walking a road, and I ain't got weary yet. Oh, I have been walking a road, dear Lord. Oh Lord, oh Lord, I have been walking a road, and I ain't got weary yet.
Some type of work tool that's keeping the rhythm, again, to keep up the flow of the productivity.
Like we were using our feet, they might be using a hoe or something of that nature. And the last before Fred comes back is ring shouts. And you can just read what it has there. This was a religious type of activity that involved shuffling the feet. You weren't supposed to pick them up too much. And shuffling and clapping. And it's called a ring shout, but shouting wasn't the the main thing. We hear shouting in churches today, but that wasn't the main thing. It was that shuffling, that encircling, clapping, and singing. And this is an example of it. Nope, that's not an example. Yep, I'm trying to go back. I'm trying to go back. Yes. Okay. I cannot play that example, and we're going to have to stop. And Fred, you can take over.
Genres of music: field hollers, ring shouts, work songs. Field hollers, ring shouts, work songs. Sure, the people found a way of coping, but they found a way of coping with a system that was inherently merciless and brutal. Consider the name field holler. When African Americans went to work in the fields, particularly with the advent of cotton in the middle of the 18th century, it was the southern cotton planters who became so wealthy because of cotton production that they gave it the name King Cotton. You know, it's not very often that in the realm of humanity that we are so aware of a thing going on at the time that we can give it a specific name. I often tell my students that, take for example, World War I. World War I, that generation of World War I called it the war to end all wars. It was so awful, so bad, so terrible, so destructive, so damaging, so traumatic. The people right then said, this is so bad, we simply cannot do this again. Human beings, we generally take 25 to 50, sometimes 100 years to understand the full scope of how bad a thing is. It will be 50, 75 years, 100 years before we recognize what the last 2 years of the pandemic have done to us. But in that moment, they knew that World War I was a terrible thing that they had to try and avoid at all costs. Likewise, in the moment when cotton was making people not wealthy, I'm talking about Jeff Bezos wealthy, Bill Gates wealthy, Stephen Jobs wealthy, super wealthy of the time, where men like William Byrd owned 400 slaves. The way to cope, one way to cope, was to sing, to get through the day. And like my colleagues pointed out, was to get through the day, to ease the pain of a system and a situation that was nothing but pain. Soon after America became independent, the leaders of the country discovered that the Articles of Confederation proved too weak, too ineffective, too dangerous to be a permanent form of government. There was a rebellion in Western Massachusetts led by a former Continental Army officer named Daniel Shays, who threatened to close down the courts and overthrow the government in Massachusetts. After the revolution, small farmers found themselves being taxed, their land confiscated, their animals being confiscated, and thrown in jail, and then hit with court costs, essentially being made to pay for their own imprisonment. And people looked around and said, how is this different than what the British were doing to us? And Daniel Shays, who fought in the Continental Army for the entire Revolutionary War, he had been given a ceremonial sword by the Marquis de Lafayette. He believed in the revolutionary experiment. He believed in the philosophy. He led that rebellion. When the governor of Massachusetts put out a call to the other states to ask for help to put down this rebellion of small farmers, the other states said, we're sorry for you, but not our problem. And then somebody figured out, if they could not put down a rebellion of small farmers, what would happen if a group of slaves decided to revolt. Slaves who had a unique and definite incentive to revolt. Can you defend yourself from small farmers? Can you defend yourself from slaves? No, you could not. So they came together and decided to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. And in the spring of 1787, they met at Philadelphia to draft a new document, a stronger document, at the Constitutional Convention. From the spring to the summer of 1787, in the hot, dusty atmosphere where they were meeting in secret, to hammer out what does it finally mean to have a free country that can last for generations. And they begin with some of the best political philosophy of the late 18th century. The preamble of the Constitution had high aspirational values and goals. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, you have to just appreciate the wisdom of the founding fathers. They had enough of a sense of humanity. These men were experienced. They were courageous. They were schooled enough, they were wise enough to know that human beings achieving a level of perfection was not going to be possible. No person, no man, no woman is capable of that. So they say, we want to be in a constant process of becoming more perfect. Someday we might get there. We want to form a more perfect union and establish justice. Why? Because we haven't had a lot of justice recently. We want to provide for the common, ensure domestic tranquility. Why? Because we haven't had a whole lot of domestic tranquility recently. We want to provide for the common defense. Why? Because we haven't had that. We want to promote the general welfare. Why? Because we have not had that either. We want to secure for ourselves the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The other thing about the Constitution was this. It was one of the first times in human history where people bothered to commit to paper the rule of law. English common law was of a type that of customs and traditions and rules and so forth that people just kind of understood in England because from generation to generation, they built upon that. And if you're part of the culture, that's the way it was. America said, we don't want to do that. We don't want to leave things to chance. They committed it to paper so that anybody who was literate could read it. We, the people of the United States. We had to ask this question. In 1787, who was we? In 1787, it turns out that we did not include Native Americans. We did not include women. We did not include poor white men. We did not include African Americans for sure. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 stipulated that there would be a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives. It'll be based on population. That population, the number of that population, the representation, they would get that number by taking the whole number of free persons, adding it to the number of indentured servants, minus Native Americans not taxed, plus 3/5 of all other persons. Several things about that. If you're not going to tax Native Americans, the rallying cry of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. The concept is, if you're taking my money, I want a voice in government. If you're not taking their money, they have no voice in government. We should not be at all surprised if for the next century and a half, Native Americans will get kicked across the continent. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 said that the migration or importation of such persons shall not be prohibited by the Congress until the year 1808, but a tax or a duty of $10 may be placed on each imported such person. The founding fathers were brilliant. They were experienced. They were wise. They were courageous. They knew what they were doing. But it's that same brilliance, that same experience, that same wisdom that both exhausts them and indicts them. Because they knew that down the hallways of history, they will become laughing stocks if they were drafting a document that was based on freedom and liberty, and then including the word slaves inside of the document. So they referred to them as such persons. They didn't know what to do with slaves in 1787. They were already a problem. So they gave us 20 years to resolve the problem and said that by 1808, we will finally find a way of getting rid of this. But nobody could have foreseen in 1793 the invention of something called the cotton gin. 1793, the cotton gin allowed cotton production to take off at a pace that Great Britain, that needed that raw material cotton, couldn't get enough of it. The planters of cotton had the good problem of having a customer who couldn't get enough of their product fast enough. So the cotton became valuable, and the people who grew the cotton, the slaves, also became valuable, which gave rise to a tributary slave system. By 1800, the state of Virginia all by itself had enough black people being reproduced naturally, to where Virginia became a natural exporter of slaves to the rest of the South. And then, just to show that slavery even invaded the sacred realm of Christianity, in Philadelphia, in 1787, the same year of the Constitutional Convention, a couple of black theologians, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, were in church with a small free black population. They had been allowed to attend St. George's United Methodist Church in Philadelphia, one of the oldest congregations in the United States. And one Sunday while they were in prayer, on their knees, follow me here, they're on their knees literally praying to God. They're having a one-on-one conversation with the master of the universe, the creator of all things, the Alpha and the Omega. And the church leaders came in there and told them to get up. They'd already been sitting on the floor where you all were, but that wasn't good enough. They had told them to go upstairs to what they call blank word heaven. They sat near the front, and they said, we can still see you. You got to sit in the back of the balcony. Then they said, you know what, just get up. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones said, we got up. And we left out of that church, and we resolved to build our own sanctuary. So even when it came to the sacred spaces of prayer, slavery did not leave any space untouched. Nothing was left unturned. It was in that environment that black people still, one more time, formed their families, their communities, and fell back on music to express what was being done in a nation that called itself free.
There was a rich music that was created during this period known as the spiritual. Not only was it sung during that period, but we still hear spirituals. Many choirs, many church choirs will sing spirituals. But remember that the Africans that were brought to this continent were not allowed to use their native tribal language. So they had to use their listening and try to adopt or assimilate to the place where they found themselves. They adopted Christianity, and they were told stories from the Bible of how God's faithfulness helped people in troubled times. Moses and the Red Sea, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, Ezekiel and the wheel. There are more than 6,000 spirituals that have been documented. But unfortunately, there's no record of that many because, again, it's an oral tradition. And we lose something through that oral. Remember, the printing press was invented towards the end of the 1800s or something like that. And all of that technology that we use today was not so readily available. But sometimes technology doesn't work. Sonia, are you setting me up? I don't know. We have a couple of, you want to talk about the coded and the?
Were effective in sending messages about freedom. Many slaves just accepted their condition and their existence um, such as songs like "Oh Freedom" and "Before I Be a Slave, I'll Be Buried in My Grave." So many of those songs were about, life in the hereafter because they um, faced their fate on earth as being a slave all of their lives. But some slaves that refused to accept their conditions um, heard about some land where they could go and be free. And so came these messages and songs, and the enslaved people were singing anyway in the fields. And so these songs were effective in disguising these messages in escape. And so the overseers in the field would just think, oh, it's you know just another song on another day. But these were actual messages and, in some ways, instructions on how to get to freedom. One song in particular is "Follow the Drinking Gourd." For the old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. And the verses in that song are the direct instructions on how to get to freedom. The story of Peg Leg Joe, left foot, peg foot, traveling on, looking for the trees that have the peg foot and then the other foot of Peg Leg Joe, crossing the Ohio River. So that's what many of these songs
And
were
following
about.
the North Star.
And following the North Star,
Yeah.
the drinking gourd.
So there are sacred overtones in this, and that's why the overseers were not able to understand the disguised language in there, because they were quite often talking about biblical things.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was the okay, it went past that. The dialect that we would hear. Now, there are people in this room that have immigrated to this country, and you brought with you your native language. And when you start to speak English, there may be consonants or vowels that are not in your language. And so you find another way of saying it. Sometimes people would laugh at you because they think that you don't know how to speak, but you don't know how to speak. And so you find that dialect in words like ribba and legend, and instead of the, duh. And when I was teaching high school, the kids used to laugh when we sang in spiritual. I said, you don't want to laugh at that. That was, when you consider that that was not the first language for these enslaved people,
Mm-hmm.
that's the way they interpreted what they heard. So you had the dialect. The Fisk Jubilee Singers were from Fisk University. You've heard the term HBCU. I went to an HBCU college, and that is a historically black college or university. And the Fisk Jubilee Singers started to take these spirituals and travel around the country, and they became popular in a sense. People wanted to hear them. But they were doing it because they needed to raise money for their university. And they went to Europe in 1870 on their first European tour, singing these spirituals which had never been sung on that soil. Now, folk music is usually, we don't know the composer. But with spirituals, many of the folk are folk music, and some are composed. So when you hear spirituals, it may have been composed or it may have been considered folk music. I talked about the dialect. I talked about the Jubilee singers. Composers. Many times you may know a composer from there, and you just heard from H.T. Burley's Deep River. Who was singing that? Any idea?
Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep
Dr. Charcy Sawyer.
I want to cross over into campground. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Deep.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer, for that recording. I also had another example there of Moses Hogan and the Moses Hogan singer singing Ezekiel Saw the Will. It's just not cooperating very well. But you do know spirituals. I mean, some of you sing them they may be in your hymnal, maybe not the Psalter, but they may be in another hymnal. And I've heard the alumni choir sing spirituals from here. But there are composers like Howell Johnson and Undine Moore and Jester Hairston and so many that have contributed to the body of spirituals.
And I will just add to that, many of those spirituals are still being sung in our churches. And in a lot of the Baptist churches, the song Wade in the Water is still done, like for baptism on first Sunday. So people still reach back to that very rich tradition.
Absolutely. Sir?
You all hear okay? Good. In the aftermath of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, the Constitution became the law of the land, as it remains. The Founding Fathers built into the document something called the amending process to account for unforeseen changes in the country that was already expanding. But by the time you get to what they call the period of the early republic, from 1820 up until 1820, and the last of the Founding Fathers died in 1826 when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died within moments of each other. The story goes is that one, on his deathbed, John Adams said, "Thomas Jefferson lives." And Thomas Jefferson said, "Long live John Adams." They had been friends for a good part of their lives, but then they fell out politically. But toward the end of their lives, they revived their friendship through letter writing. But by the time 1826 came, America had already been through one of its biggest crises that threatened the existence of the country. In 1819, Missouri applied for admission to the Union, which was growing very, very fast. And for the first time, although it had always been a problem, for the first time, it became a national debate, particularly among the politicians. Missouri applied to join the Union as a slave state. You see, at the Constitutional Convention, everybody could agree that if you're going to have the House of Representatives based on population, everybody understood that Connecticut was always going to be smaller than New York, and that South Carolina would always be smaller than Virginia. People understood that because inherently they had different populations. But to counterbalance the disadvantage that Connecticut had in the House, they said in the Senate, every state will get 2 senators, no matter what the size. That way there's total equality, no matter what the population. That was the compromise. So every time a state joined the Union, the big question was, would it come in as a slave or a free state? Because the Senate was the last place that a bill went to before they kicked it upstairs to the president to either sign it into law or to veto it. When Missouri came in, applied for admission to the Union, in 1819, the number of states in the Union was 11 free, 11 slaves. What was at stake was the balance in the Senate. Would it become one more free state will give the advantage to the North, one more slave state will give the advantage to the South. So a great debate arose in the country. Retired on his estate in Monticello, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, who had been out of public life for a while now, he heard about what was going on. He was greatly distressed by it. In 1820, he wrote a letter to his friend John Holmes, expressing his dismay and his fear for the nation. He said that when the slave debate started over Missouri, he said it struck him like a fire bell in the night. Let me help you out. In the 19th century, with every building just about being made out of wood, if you live in a town or a village and there's a fire bell, that meant everybody should get hands on deck because everybody's home or business was at risk. Everything was going to go up in flames. So when Thomas Jefferson says it hit me like a fire bell in the night, it meant that it caused great alarm for me and the whole nation. And then, having no other way to really describe it, he said, I fear that the situation that we're in right now is like having a wolf by the ears. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. The wolf was slavery. And the wolf was hungry. And the wolf was aggressive. And Thomas Jefferson was saying, we cannot stand here and hold this wolf like this indefinitely. This is not sustainable, would be the modern way of saying it. But we also can't let him go or else it will kill us. What shall we do? America was in a fix. As it was, Maine applied to come into the Union as a free state. Missouri came in as a slave state. And so the balance in the Senate was maintained, now 12-12. Then November 1860, the long gentleman from Illinois was elected president of the United States. By then, a very young Republican Party, which had come together in 1854 in Jackson, Michigan, disaffected Whigs and constitutional unionists and people from the Free Soil Party, the Labor, the Know Nothing Party, disaffected Democrats from the South. The only thing they could agree upon was the fact that they disagreed with the way things were going. And so they had as a platform, we do not want to deal with this anymore. So the Republican Party of 1860 said, our party platform is no further spread of slavery. We should take note. It was not to get rid of slavery, just not let it spread any farther west. They're completely happy with it being the way it was, just contain it from going any farther west. But for the Southerners, that wasn't good enough. For them, they saw not letting it spread any farther as being the essential death knell for it. So in December 1860, South Carolina did something called secede from the Union. We're going to leave the Union of States. Abraham Lincoln later on would say, there's never been a time when we had not been the United States. Even during the colonial period, we were the United Colonies. A man can leave his wife or a wife can leave her husband, but we cannot separate from each other. In his first inaugural address, as he got toward the end of his address, he said, no one has taken an oath to make you do what you're doing, but I have taken an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. You don't have to do this. I've taken an oath. I'm going to do my job. Please don't make me do this. Please. We're not enemies. We must be friends. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War was on. Before it was over with, the Civil War would take more American lives than have been lost in any war since then, including World War II and World War I, Korea, Vietnam. That 4-year conflict. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln, on the battlefield of Gettysburg, said 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 77 years. what happened in 87 years, in one lifetime? What had happened? Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Abraham Lincoln had it right. The eyes of the world were upon us. The rest of the world knew what had been the usual history of humanity. Republics had come, they had gone, they never lasted. This one was supposed to last. It was being tested. Could it make it? And the big issue still was slavery. Black people during the Civil War did not wait for permission to take themselves free. They did what we call voting with their feet. By the time the Civil War was over with, the Union Army would have 186,000 black soldiers in it. On March 4th, 1865, when Abraham Lincoln gave the second inaugural address, he took a moment to just engage in some of his own cosmic wondering. As he thought about the causes of the war, he said as part of that address, "It may seem strange that any man would dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing his bread from the sweat of other men's faces." Consider that. It would have been one thing if he said, "It may seem strange that any man would dare to ask God's assistance," but he qualified it. It may seem strange that any man would dare to ask a just God's assistance. Wait a minute. You mean Abraham Lincoln saying this is a God who understands justice versus injustice. This is a God who weighed in on the side of the Hebrews who were being abused by the Egyptians. This is a God that, was the pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. This is the God who parts Red Seas and drowns chariots in Pharaoh, the best of Pharaoh's army. This is a God who's always waiting on the side of the dispossessed, the marginalized, the homeless, the hungry. This is a God who chose to have his own son born in a barn instead of a palace. He's got a thing about helping people who are downtrodden, down and out, and on the margins. You want that God to help you wring your bread from the sweat of other men's faces? Do you even know who you're dealing with? Do you understand? But then he said, let us judge so that we will not be judged. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth put a bullet in the back of the president's head, the last shot fired of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery. Lincoln had fought for it. It didn't stop. Slavery metastasized into something called Jim Crow segregation and sharecropping. The 14th Amendment was passed that was supposed to grant dual citizenship. I'm a citizen of the state of Michigan and a citizen of the United States as well. Why even bother with that? Well, because in 1860, there were 31 million people in the U.S., 22 million in the North, 9 million in the South. Of the 9 million in the South, 3.5 to 4 million were black slaves. When the war's over with and there's no more slavery, who are these people? They're not immigrants. They've been born right here. They didn't sneak across the border. They were born right here. How do you classify them? Dual citizenship. And then equal protection of the law. In the 15th Amendment, giving black men, sadly only men, the right to vote. Women will have to wait until the 20th century. But in 1866, less than a year after the war ended, in Pulaski, Tennessee, an organization, a domestic terrorist organization called the Ku Klux Klan was founded. It eventually became the leading organization that was designed with the one intent to do one thing only: keep black people in their place. The Constitution is giving you rights that you've earned. Yes, you helped fight for freedom in the Civil War, but that means nothing to us because the spirit of slavery and oppression remains here. And by the time you get to 1877, when Reconstruction is over, all the gains of the battlefield have been pretty much lost as far as black people are concerned, because now the new thing, Jim Crow, has become the law of the land. Black life is criminalized through things like the vagabond laws or the vagrancy laws. If a black man is standing on a corner in South Carolina, doesn't have a job, he can be arrested and thrown in jail. That jail sentence can be extended to 6 months. He's not going to be allowed to just lay around and do nothing, so they put him on a chain gang working on the railroad. Let me ask you a question. When you're being made to work and not getting paid against your will and not being paid, what's that called? They took the system that was in name and then established it It's not a name in reality. There it was again. That system of chain gang, Jim Crow, criminalization would last all the way up until the middle of the 20th century. And one more time, black people would protest, they would try to go through the laws, education, a number of different things, but always, when things got rough, when to cope, to go into the future, there's always a song in someone's heart. Because sometimes it's one thing to have joyful music, but sometimes the best way to express the sorrow of the heart, the hope for the future, is to render it up to God. Sing his praises. Let the melodies do the work for you.
Fred talked about the Civil War, and one of the forms of music that came out of that, we talked about spirituals, but equivalent to spirituals was the blues. They share a lot of things. One is sacred, one is secular. And the blues is probably the most simple form of music that there is. Why don't you count with me? I want you to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, like so. Okay, and we're going to go up to 12. Start again. 2, ready, and go. 1, 2, 3. This is locked. 2, 2, 3, 4, 3. Okay, stop. This is locked. I can't play the piano. Deborah, you think we've been set up? I don't know. Okay, you may not have the key, but it's a very simple form of music. Can you just play the drum? Or with your mouth, or you? Yeah. No, but with your hands maybe. Or something. No? Now you're going to count. Ready? A count right now. Don't get it. Keep going. Well, I'm at Calvin College, trying to teach a class called Call. Wow! I'm at Calvin College, trying to teach a class called Call. I hope the folks are listening. Maybe they don't hear me at all. But we are going to come back next week and teach some more. You understand that it's a very simple form of music. Man, your standards are kind of low if you gave me that applause. Okay, yeah, so it's a simple form of music. The poetry is simple, the form is simple. And that was founded around the time of the Civil War. Sorry, there it is. The key?
We have a key.
Well, now we're moving on because our time is running out.
Well, they can hear just a little bit of it.
Yeah. So that's a pretty simple form of music, and it's called 12-bar blues. And, you know, you still hear the 12-bar blues today with folks like Muddy Water and Robert Johnson and John Lee Hooker. You hear the guitar, the slide, you know, on the guitar and harmonica and, you know, contraptions that don't work. And
There it is.
next week, we're not going to have this problem. I'm going to bring my own stuff. So I said spirituals and blues are related. And Deborah's going to talk about gospel, but you'll see that gospel and pop music are related. One sacred, one secular.
So, the beginnings of gospel, they were not like composed songs. So, after slavery ended, African Americans started forming their own churches and things. And so, the music of the church would be run by the deacons of the church. So, they didn't necessarily have the best voices, but they were the ones in charge. So, they did all of the praying and then the singing of the songs. And so when people would join in singing, there would be no organized harmony. It would be what we call now sing blend. So you get in where you fit in. And so hopefully we can hear an example of that.
Yeah, okay.
Congregational singing.
You know, you see lining out there, and that's something that dates back to actually the Pilgrims. Because they didn't have hymnals, someone would stand, line out the hymn, and the congregation will sing. And the same thing is applicable here. I hope that we can hear an example of this.
Maybe if they can activate it.
I hate to touch this button, but that's where it is. Should I try?
Let's try.
Nope, it went away. Sonia, are you able to play it back there? There. Push. Oh, this was such a good one, too. You know what? We did work in preparation of this. And so because this is the first time we're doing it, there's technical issues.
I can sing an example of it.
Do it.
Come and go to that land. Come and go to that land. Come and go to that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. Come and go to that land. Come and go to that land. Come and go to that land where I'm bound. I have a Savior in that land. Just join in. I have a Savior in that land. I have a Savior in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. I have a Savior in that land. I have a Savior in that land. I have a Savior in that land where I'm bound. I got one more verse. Peace and happiness in that land. Come on now. Peace and happiness in that land. Peace and happiness in that land where I'm bound, where peace and happiness in that land. Peace and happiness in that land. Peace and happiness in that land where I'm bound. So that is my tradition that I grew up in. And matter of fact, when I was little, we were placed on the instruments, and we had to, wherever the deacon struck out, they could strike out on any song, and we just join in. Again, people just create their own harmonies, and you may hear some hollering out during the song. So that is part of my tradition, where I'm very proud of that, because that has contributed to
and
who
it
I am
dates
today.
back. I mean,
And
it has lasted this many years.
And there are churches that are still doing it,
Yeah.
that still have deacons lead in what's called the devotion.
Yes. We have come to a cadential moment, meaning we are at the end of our session, and we have some time You're pointing for questions. Is that what I'm? Yes. Thank you. I love this. And oh, how are you? This is Nate
Yeah, this might
Glasper.
be
He
better.
directs
Yeah,
the
let's move this.
gospel choir
Yeah.
and does an amazing job and is well respected as a musician and a leader. So you have questions to Fred or Deborah or myself about anything that we've talked about? No one? You know, one of
Okay.
the
We
sources.
have someone?
I'm going to go. Hi,
Okay.
Deborah.
Oh, good.
Hi there.
I know you.
Dwayne.
Hi, Terry.
I was at your Black Church, the history of the Black Church, a presentation probably a year and a half ago, and it cleared up, how the church is spread. But do you think this is ever going to end? I mean, are we going to be part of a church together? I know I have every right to go to another church, a Baptist or a Black church, and we just recently went to Chicago and St. Sabinus in
Yeah.
Chicago. That was just an Sabinus, out-of-body experiences because it was real and music and dance. But I'm just curious if, particularly studying history, are we ever going to join song and hymns?
I mean,
Do you
that is
think?
Sunday is one of the most segregated times,
Yeah.
of the week, where we may be serving the same God, but we just feel that we have to be with our own to do that.
But as you said today, it clears up as to how it happened and why it's still existing. And we know our world today is just more separated.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
and I'm putting you on the spot. You don't have that answer, but someone who grew up, and I grew up in a blended neighborhood, and I have a different approach to
Maybe
an answer.
this is, you're right, there's no answer to it, but maybe this can give a response that can give you some comfort. There's a lot of polarization right now. We need to remember that at the start of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed. A lot of pastors, black and white, were telling him, you're moving too fast. You're upsetting people. And he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail. A lot of you probably read it, where he said, you know what? People have been saying we're moving too fast. We've been moving like this for 300 years. I think 300 years is long enough. There was great pushback. And so there was great pushback because there was great progress being made. There's great pushback right now because the country's undergoing a demographic change. And quite frankly, some people don't like that. There's great pushback. We got through the last one. Whether or not we actually end up in the situation that you're talking about, where we are one church, that would depend upon what Christians either will or won't let happen. If we are of the imago Dei, that is all made in God's image, because God's very clear about it. We're made in his image and nothing else. So if that's true, we come together irrespective of you looking different from me, because our identity is in him, not in my tribe. If we focus on that, no matter what's going on outside, that will take place. If we don't stop in what we're trying to do and make that a reality. It can happen. But how soon it's going to happen, I would not venture to say. But it can happen.
Good. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Would you say that hip-hop or rap is the next evolution of African-American music?
We are going to touch upon that in section 4. And it is a genre that came out of a number of different types of my genres of music that I'll let my colleagues speak on, because they're the music experts.
So that means you have to come to class. Get that answer. I just want to tell you one of the sources that I use, and this is a newer book, but I have maybe gone through 3 of these books. The Music of Black Americans by Eileen Fisher is one that's well respected as far as being, good documentation of the music. Go right ahead, please.
I just want to comment that your live music beats the recorded music any day of the week. Thank you. Thank you.
I had to tell you that right before we got started, somebody said to me, "Are you going to sing?" And I said, "I don't do that to my friends."
I'm Jim Kramer, and my late wife, Liz Holdsworth Kramer, started working with a group called Christians for Urban Justice while she was already in high school at the Lexington Christian Academy in Boston, and started working together doing weatherization projects with African American people. After I met her, we worked with the Mennonite Board of Missions in Strawberry Mansion, North Philadelphia. After that, we came back. I'm a 30-year member at Madison Square Christian Reformed Church. Deborah Perry and Mr. Davis, you have had my daughters.
I know I have. I know.
You know?
When you said Kramer, I'm going, yes, of course.
Yes, and I have right over there. You know, a piece that my wife did in artwork, and she did African American church sanctuary artwork and multicultural. I'm a widower for 4 years, but there was a teenager from our church who was killed by a stray bullet. And I have African American Christ on that little piece, you know, with Christ behind it. And any one of us can be going to like St. Philip's Episcopal. We can be going to any church, and there's a lot that has been happening.
Yes.
And we followed Dr. John Perkins into CCDA work, but I've said too much already. God bless you, and
thank you.
Keep on keeping on.
Thank you. Every year your daughter sings in the community chorus, and one thing that we like about that chorus is that it brings to different types of people together that might not ordinarily worship together, but that once a week when that chorus gets together, and the respect for each other is why we keep doing it. Go right ahead, sir.
I'm just wondering if in all of this, in your studies of all of this, have you followed the Jubilee prophecy concept in the civil rights movement in black music? Because I have found it recurring and recurring. 1915, 1965, 2015. And the Jubilee prophecy is every 50 years, people in bondage will be set free. I think that Dr. King targeted 1965 to pass the Voting Rights Act for that particular reason. I'm just surmising. But anyway.
Well, now you're wanting me to now read.
What?
I need to do a little reading on that. That's interesting.
Leviticus 25, I think.
Yeah.
Which slaves were not allowed to hear.
Right. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Rich Visser. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned there were two main influences on folk music in America. One was the
Anglo, I said the British.
And the other one was the Appalachian. Would you say that bluegrass has impacted folk music?
No, I said that Anglo-Americans, mostly those from the British Isles, and African Americans were the two main contributors. And so, you know, you can go to Appalachia now and hear music that you would hear in Scotland or Wales or so, and out of that came the bluegrass, of course.
Okay.
So that's a stream of that folk music. Absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all for letting us share part of your afternoon. We'll see you next week. Well done.
I don't have anything in my pocket right now.